Welcome back, everyone. The conversation continues, and it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Jeff McNair. I've been a long admirer of Jeff and his work and his writing and his character. We actually have kind of had parallel paths in some way. We both had the same major, Christian education, went to the same undergraduate institution, though separated by a couple, 2 or 3 years at least. And then also took on positions as professors of special education in our field. And when I was just beginning and looking for who is doing work at this intersection of faith and disability, it was Jeff McNair who was doing the scholarship looking at how do we help connect adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities well to life in their community, including their faith communities, and what does it look like for congregations to support them well. And it always struck me that that work was really marked by a commitment to full participation and to belonging and to reciprocity. And I think those marks have really characterized Jeff and who he is and where he's invested. His wife, Kathy, and he have been part for more than 40 years of an inclusive community that includes people with and without intellectual disabilities, learning and living and worshiping and serving together. He now serves as Director of Church Relations for the Christian Institute on Disability, which is an arm of Johnny and Friends. He's a professor of special education and disability studies at California Baptist University, and you're probably wondering how he does all of these things together. He started what was the first graduate program in disability ministry, and if you're not familiar or a follower of his blog, Disabled Christianity, you ought to be. It's a compelling reading and really reflects his heart for this work. His talk today is titled Growing Up, Disability Ministry and Persons with Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. And there's going to be a window after he shares for about 20 minutes for your questions. So begin to think about how you want to continue the conversation that he'll start with us. And if you'll join me in welcoming Dr. Jeff McNair.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm sure you're all feeling like I am, blessed with our morning. Already, oh my gosh, the last presenters, thank God for you guys. You guys were amazing. You guys were just amazing. Like Eric said, I've been a person who's been involved with intellectual developmental disabilities for a long time, ministry for a long time. I'm very passionate about this. I'll try not to swear, but I'm very passionate about this. In my opinion, the Christian church in the world has been disobedient. That's my starting point. And so what we need to do from a Christian perspective is bring the church to obedience. And the presence of people with disabilities in numbers that represent the community would be a start towards a correction for the church because of all the things that they bring. So let's just dive in here. The point of this is I'm trying to kind of connect a little bit of information on disability studies with disability ministry. Now, those of you who know the field of disability studies, there's probably about as many models of disability as there are people in the room here. I mean, everybody comes up with their model. I'm actually working on mine at the moment, hoping to publish it later this summer. But there are many, many models, which are kind of ways to try to understand what disability is. I think a lot of them can be boiled down to 2 major ones. And I want to use these 2 major models or ways of understanding disability as a way to potentially describe what ministry should look like, right? If I'm going to minister to people who have this characteristic called impairment or disability, you know, it might help to know what disability is. I mean, it could be a good starting point. And there's a degree to which people think that that is potentially obvious as to what disability is, but clearly it's far from obvious. It's clearly far from obvious. It's something that we're continuing to work out and understand. If you were able to see the next slide, it would, there it is. Okay. So the 2 models that I want to dance with a little bit, very, very briefly, are the medical model and the social model. The medical model basically says that disability is a characteristic that's housed within an individual. Right? So disability is owned by an individual. The focus is on, quote, repairing the individual. And the idea is that maybe we can fix you. Now, I've kind of put this in terms that seem a bit negative, but I'm a special ed professor, right? I believe in the medical model. I want to teach people with in my case, severe disabilities, the ability to do things that they should be able to do if someone took the time to educate them, right? I mean, Eric is a special ed professor. He's seeking to do the same thing. We have doctors in the audience. We have rehab specialists in the audience. We have all kinds of people who are doing things, who are attempting to maximize whatever the abilities are of individuals who have this characteristic called impairment. There's nothing wrong with that. That's totally laudable. There's not a darn thing wrong with trying to maximize people's abilities. The problem comes where if I think that disability is exclusively something housed in an individual. That's where I start to have a problem. Well, in the 80s and 90s, a second model started to be developed, and that was called the social model. And the social model basically said the problem is not the individual with impairment, but the society around the individual. And so that disability is basically, I do have this characteristic, but my larger problem is that disability is discrimination. So I define disability as discrimination, right? That's what it is, exclusively. So, but you think about that, if disability is in part a societal problem, that changes the focus of my interventions from the individual to the society, to the environment, right? So I'm trying to address social discrimination. Now, thank God there is no social discrimination within religious communities, you know? Why am I even here talking about that? I could probably just say, no, I mean, clearly, religious communities are complicit in the social discrimination that individuals who have the characteristic impairment face. And, I mean, my initial comment is, God forgive us. Whoever we're representing as our faith community, God forgive us for the way that we've interacted with people with disabilities. And I often say when I teach about disability ministry, you know, the starting point of disability ministry is going to people with disabilities and their families and saying, please forgive us. That's the starting point of disability ministry, because we have been horrible toward people with disabilities. Another aspect of the social model is that oftentimes people with disabilities, at least that I've known, will say that the hardest part of having a disability is not your disability, it's the way you're treated because you have a disability. Right? Now, clearly there are people who experience, you know, physical pain, and I'm not trying to minimize any of that. I'm just saying that there's a whole lot of people that say my life would be a heck of a lot better if people would treat me differently than they treat me, because I see this, they say I have this characteristic called impairment, and there's a cascade of negativity that flows out of that. Okay? Medical model, social model. Let's begin by talking a little bit about some medical model types of interventions. This is a dear, 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 dear friend of mine. His name's Mark. I have lunch with him every Friday. He calls me when I'm traveling. Are we having lunch today? I said, no, man, I told you I'm traveling, you know, but every Friday we have lunch. I hear the same stories about his girlfriends and his love life and all this other kind of stuff. Things about his love life that I'd actually rather not hear, if you know what I mean. But Mark is a dear, dear friend. Just to kind of give you a notion of the idea of ministry development and the potential of people that people think do not have potential. When I teach a Sunday school class, which I do every Sunday, our group is called the Light and Power Company. We have somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 to 80 individuals with various types of disabilities every week, trying to facilitate integration within our local church community as best as we can. If you were to come to the Sunday school class that we teach, you would feel totally comfortable there in terms of the content, in terms of the activities, and so forth, because this is an adult Sunday school class, right? And if you're having adults in the Sunday school class, you treat adults like adults. How about that as a starting point? We're going to come back to that later. But I remember one week I was talking about the 1 Peter 2 passage, 11, where it talks about we're stranger and aliens in this world. And I was trying to set the stage, and I said, you guys ever watch television? Oh, yeah, I watch television. You ever watch the news and see that people are being killed and all this terrible stuff? Oh, yeah, I watch that. I said, you ever think, what am I doing here? You know, the Bible says we're strangers and aliens. What are we doing here? Mark raises his hand immediately and says, I'll tell you what you're doing here, Jeff. What you're doing here is tell the people who are doing the bad things about Jesus. That's what you're doing here. And I thought, brilliant. Brilliant, right? Another time I will bring adults with intellectual disabilities to my class to meet teachers who are going to be just general teachers, but also special ed teachers. And I'll sometimes ask my friend Mark, I'll say, do you have a disability? And it's kind of, on one hand, it's kind of sad because I ask him at the beginning, why you're here, Mike? I'm here to teach your students about disability. And then I say, do you have a disability? He says, you know, I don't think so. And I'm like, But, because he says, I got a job, I drive my bike to work, I got friends, I don't know if I have a disability. And I know the people that he knows. They're people with all different types of impairments. And I say to Mark, I say, well, do you know anybody who has a disability? And he goes, well, I don't know. That Brad, he's got a disability. And I said, really, what is his disability? This is the intellectually disabled person. If we were in a group, a bunch of PhDs, we would not come up with this answer. The intellectually disabled person says, Brad's disability, he swears a lot and he can't get along with other people. That's the answer, right? That's a disability, that's the answer. And it comes from somewhere. So I start with the story just to kind of say, this is, when I'm trying to do faith development and ministry with adults with intellectual disabilities, I'm not like lowering or something to their level. It's not like I'm stepping down to, we are peers, and they understand a whole lot of stuff. And when I'm talking, if you were my class and I was talking to my class, I would not be the person with the greatest love in the room, right? I would not be the person with the greatest love in the room. If I wanted to learn about loving other people, I would not sit at the feet of a pastor. Forgive me, I would not sit at the feet of a rabbi. I would definitely not sit at the feet of a professor. But I might sit at the feet of a person with Down syndrome. And then maybe I'd, learn how to love my neighbor if I acted like those people. The other thing is, I'm not the greatest person with faith in the room when I stand before my group of people with intellectual disabilities, right? I get confused by all this evolution stuff and all this other thing. It kind of boggles my mind, and I wonder about stuff. Whereas people often with intellectual disabilities will have a very basic, very simple, very strong faith, right? Now think about this for a second. What does the Bible say are the greatest two commandments? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, your mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. So we got a whole room full of people who got the two most important things in life right. But the thing that we do is we dismiss them and say, well, they got it right because they have an intellectual disability. Right? Because they don't know any better. If they knew better, they'd be more like me, questioning everything. Right? So there's a degree to which we harm ourselves. And this, when you say this to people, people say, oh, what a sweet thing to say, that you're so nice to the people with intellectual disabilities. No. We harm ourselves when we exclude people who actually get this life right to some extent on the basis of characteristics which should largely be irrelevant. So I want to run through just some things about faith development. I don't want to go into this. Eric mentioned my weblog. I kind of dance with all of these different levels from Fowler. If you haven't read Fowler, something interesting, you may or may not agree with his perspective. But basically, I just put this up there to say there are people who have thought about faith development. And there are people who thought about stages of faith development. So there are people at different stages of faith development. So I can facilitate people's growth at their stage of faith development. And not everybody's at the same level. Are you with me on this a little bit? So if I'm doing faith development, I think everybody, from a Christian perspective, everybody needs to memorize the doggone Nicene Creed or something. That's not where their level of faith development might be. It might be at a different place. And I can maximize their faith development at the place where they are at. And that's one of the things we want to think about. So think stages of faith. All right, let me dance real quickly with 5 basic development principles for faith. First, there are strategies to teach people. I'm going to talk in a minute about what not to do, but there are strategies to teach people. There is a thing called special education, and you can find out about it. And there are things that you can do that facilitates people's learning. Imagine that. I mean, yeah, God can do miracles in the lives of people, but God also gave us brains to figure things out. And one of the things we figured out is ways to facilitate learning in individuals with various disabilities. So if you're trying to work with that group of people, you ought to find out some of the strategies that can be useful in facilitating faith development in those people. Right? Seems a little obvious to me, but we don't do it. We don't do it necessarily. The second one says they're knowledge-based faith development. I often talk to people and I say, people with disabilities, I'm thinking like intellectual always, but I think it would go across the board. If people with intellectual disabilities came to the church in the numbers in which they're represented in the community, you wouldn't even recognize the church. The changes that they would facilitate in the church would make it hardly recognizable. And you can sit down with me and I'll unpack that for you a little bit. I mean, one of the bottom line things would be that we'd learn to love our neighbor, for goodness sakes. Can you imagine if you had a church that actually loved its neighbor, what it would look like? it would not look like the churches that we currently are engaged in right now, right? Because we have been taught a way of loving our neighbor that is easy. And if you make any demands on me, well, maybe I can find a different neighbor. And we've already heard stories since we've been here, and I can tell you these stories are true, where people will come. I'll tell you one true story. There was a couple that grew up in a church in Virginia. This is a long time ago. Grew up in a church in Virginia, went through the youth group, got married in the church, and obviously a baby was coming along. The baby was born with very severe cerebral palsy, very, very severe cerebral palsy. At the birth of the baby, the church went to the person and said, there's no longer a place for you here. And now these people are looking online to find a place in America where they could go, where there was a church that would welcome children like their son or daughter. And somehow or other, by God's grace, they found our church. So they came from Virginia to California to find a church where people would welcome them at that time. But there's an aspect of this change in faith development. The way that we do faith development right now is very, very knowledge-oriented. How many Bible verses do you know? Can you say this right thing? Can you do this? Can you do this? Now imagine if Mother Teresa was standing here. Wouldn't it be incredible if Mother Teresa was standing here? Imagine if Mother Teresa was standing here and the incredible ways in which she's acted out her faith. And I say, well, okay, you think you're all that? Tell me 20 Bible verses. And she goes, 19. Well, you know, there's some work for you to do here, you know, before we... Our notions of faith development are so intellectually based. And when a person with an intellectual disability shows up in some kind of a faith setting, we don't know what to do with them, right? Because we have intellectually based faith development practices. A person has an intellectual disability, and now we don't know what to do with them because we can't use our intellectually based faith development practices. You with me? Right? But what if instead of talking about loving our neighbor, we actually had people love their neighbor? No, that couldn't happen. I'll give you an example. Somewhat apocryphal, mostly true, but I apocryphized it a little bit because it makes it a better story. There was a young woman, college-age woman with mental illness who came to our church and wanted to be a part of the college-age group. She went to college-age group and she had serious mental illness, and she would swear at everybody in the college group, and she'd cause all these problems, and the coup de grace was in the middle of the night. She'd call the youth pastor and say, you know that sexual thing you did? I'm telling the police about it. Well, there was no sexual thing, but that was what she was saying she was going to do, so he was scared to death now. So the pastoral staff came to my wife and I, who are kind of like the disability ministry advocates at our church, and said, surely this is somebody we can kick out. I mean, this person does not belong here. And to God's glory, we said, what does she bring that you wouldn't have if she wasn't there? Right? My understanding of the scriptures, starting with, I could go through it all, I don't want to do it. It's so hard to keep it to 40 minutes. The scriptures imply purpose over and over and over related to the lives of individuals with disabilities. And one of my favorite passages is the 1 Corinthians 12 passage, where it talks about the body of Christ, and you get around verse 21, 22, and it says, the parts of the body that seem weaker are indispensable. So when a person shows up who challenges the way I'm doing everything, right, my response is to say, I wonder what you're going to bring that's going to change the way we do things so that we're more reflective of who we should be. So the thing we did with this woman was we said, okay, all you people in this college Bible study, we have a woman with severe mental illness. It's very unlikely she's going to be able to change because she has severe mental illness. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to invite her to come, and when she comes here, she starts swearing at people. We're going to say, listen, you're not supposed to swear at people. We don't want you swearing at people here. If you swear at people, we're going to have to ask you to leave. Right? Medical model. Trying to assist her to grow to the degree she's able to. And then the other thing we're going to do, though, is we're going to have a Bible study. And one night, a month, or a week, or whatever, we're going to have a Bible study. And I'll get 6 or 8 volunteers from here to be in that Bible study. And the point of that Bible study is that woman can be as mentally ill as her mental illness causes her to be. It doesn't matter what she do. We're going to love her and accept her with the love of Christ. I don't care what she does. She's going to learn the love and acceptance of the love of Christ in that Bible study. Okay? Now think about the Bible studies you've been in. I got some people with old heads look like me, a little bit of gray hair. You've probably been in 100 Bible studies, right? If I said to you, what was the Bible study like when you were in college? You say, you know, there's a cute guy in that Bible study. But no, I don't remember exactly what it was. You will never forget the Bible study where you learned to love a mentally ill woman. Never, right? And once I know how to love a mentally ill woman, you're easy, right? Because I have learned truly what it means to love my neighbor by being involved with people who can be difficult to love because of their social skill deficits or because of how they challenge my traditions. And then I actually learn what it is to love my neighbor instead of just talking about it. So the thing that will happen, I think, is that potentially with the presence of individuals with particularly intellectual disabilities, it'll change our notion of faith development, and it'll change it in a positive way. It'll make us better in terms of doing faith development. We learn about faith as a relationship, right? It's really interesting, and you got theologians here who can unpack this. The thing that always blew my mind is the story in Mark 2, right? Remember the guy's lowered through the roof, and he's the quadriplegic. He's not saying anything. He's not doing anything. How in the heck he got to the church? It must have been his friends brought him there, right? I don't know how else he could have gotten there. What does Jesus say when he's lowered through the roof? It says, when Jesus saw their faith, he said to the man, your sins are forgiven. Now, you can unpack that for me a little bit, you theologians, but there's an aspect of which, if I bring people who don't have the ability to come, somehow or other that impacts their relationship with the Lord, or the potential that they have in terms of growth with the Lord, or the things that can happen to them. In this case, the guy got healed, for goodness sakes. So there's that aspect. There's a relationship part of faith development. I'll talk about that a little bit more later, too. And then the notion of individuals with disabilities are indispensable. We've already talked a bit about gifting. Somebody mentioned yesterday the 1 Corinthians 12 verse. It's verse 18, where it says, God put the parts of the body together. Sorry. God put the parts of the body together just as he wanted them to be. That's not what it says. It says, God put the parts of the body together, every one of them, exactly how he wanted them to be. So when people with severe, profound, intellectual, whatever disability show up, I mean, I get like all excited, right? Because now the whole body of Christ is going to be here. And this person has been gifted in a particular way. And they've never had a platform to express their gifting before. So maybe there'll be a chance that I can see what their gifting is. Because now they're here. And you say, well, what would the gifting of a person with a severe intellectual disability be? Was you ever hear the story of the Good Samaritan? I've heard it. You never heard it this way. So there's a guy, he's beaten and left for dead. I had a friend who was beaten and left for dead. So I actually knew a person with a beaten and left for dead disability. He had a brainstem injury. He lived the rest of his life with hearing impairments and used a wheelchair because he was paralyzed from the waist down because of his brainstem injury. So I know what a person like that is like. First thing, Jesus asks who his neighbor. He describes a man with severe physical disability who has no ability to do anything for himself. That's who your neighbor is when you ask Jesus who your neighbor is, even if temporarily. But the thing about gifting, right? The thing about gifting. This guy is laying here, he's beaten and he's left for dead. He's not doing anything. He's just laying there. Yeah, think about it. The first religious walks by, ooh, yeah, I'm going to get around this way, right? The next religious leader walks by, sees him, ooh, whatever. His mere presence reveals the character of everybody around him. You want to talk about gifting? Put a person in here who makes demands on people in their environment so that they can be present, so they can be worshiping, so they can be participating. It'll reveal the character of everyone around them, which is one of the reasons I believe why they're not there. Because we do not want our character revealed. It's a whole lot easier to say there's a better church view down the street than it is for us to have our character and our lack of love for our neighbor revealed by having people who will cause us to have to be challenged in our love of our neighbor present with us. So they're indispensable. We can't be who we are meant to be if they're not present. Another thing about indispensable, right? That passage also starts out, says, the parts of the body that seem weaker. People with disabilities, I mean, they seem weaker to me sometimes. But they're indispensable. Well, if I'm indispensable to you, what does that imply? It implies I have power over you. Right? But if I say you're indispensable and I dismiss you and kind of push you aside, you never have the opportunity to express the power that you have over me because of your indispensable nature. I wrote an article about this. You can find this called, it's called The Power of Those Who Seem Weaker. And it's all about this notion that if these people are actually present, we actually allow them to express their gifting, the reason they're described as indispensable will become evident to us. But we'll never know what that is because we always exclude them. Let's talk about a couple of ministry approaches that I would say you should avoid, right? And I'm going to step on some people's toes here, and I have to really say I don't care. So I'm going to step on your toes a bit. Sometimes you'll go into churches, and you'll see people. Well, I'll just tell you the story. I went into a church one time in Southern California, and there was a handful of adults maybe 5, 6, 8 adults, severe intellectual disabilities, and the teacher was doing a lesson on, what is this? Noah. Jeez. On Noah. Now, I could get into a discussion of whether we even need to have a lesson on Noah for adults with severe intellectual disabilities. I mean, what's the take-home lesson of Noah? You know, how does that apply to the lives of people with severe intellectual disabilities? I'll let you interact with that. But we start asking questions about what are things that are truly relevant in the Bible that we should teach people that's really going to be what we would call functional in their lives. But anyway, they're doing a lesson on Noah. And these adults with severe intellectual disabilities are all sitting around as this woman does this kind of intellectual presentation of the story of Noah, and then she busts out her, you know, her Noah boat with the toys, passes them around, you know, and I get to hold the elephant, you get to hold the monkey, and, you know, you get to hold the giraffe, and we're all sitting there with this thing and talking about two on the boat, and God destroyed the world, and he's not going to do it anymore, and when we see a rainbow, that's why. And then we gather it all up, and she thinks she taught something to these people. I can tell you, adults with severe intellectual disabilities, they are not holding a giraffe and thinking, oh, this is a metaphorical representation of an actual giraffe, which is this size and makes noise and licks and moves around and stuff like that. This is not actually they're not thinking that, right? They're not thinking that. So if you think you're thinking that, you're reflecting a lack of knowledge about who adults with intellectual disabilities are, right? And then when I asked the teacher about, and also, oh, by the way, and you're also treating these adults as children, right? If we were all in a Bible study and I passed out these toys, you'd kind of think, oh, this is kind of a cheeky way of doing something. You wouldn't think I was actually trying to teach you about Noah using these toys, right? Well, when it was all done, I said to the woman said, so what do you think of the lesson? If you don't want my opinion, don't, don't ask me, right? I will sell, everything was great, thank you for the opportunity to be here. But if you want my opinion, I'll tell you what I think, and you can take it or leave it. She said, what do you think about that? And I said, I had a lot of problem with that. I said, you know, you're doing this lesson, you're, you know, intellectual approach, et cetera, et cetera. And she says, well, but the Bible says in Isaiah 55, you know, that my word goes out from my mouth, that it will not return empty, but I will accomplish what it desires. And I totally believe that, right? But basically she was saying, and she actually said this, God can use a miracle in order to open the minds of people with severe disabilities so they can understand something of the scriptures. And I get that. I mean, there are a whole lot of things that we learn, and I believe it's because God reached down, touched us somehow, and opened our minds. But I walked out of there. I didn't say this to this woman. I have a bit of a filter, not, you know. I walked out of there, and I thought to myself, this ministry should have a byline. Come to our disability ministry. It'll be a miracle if you learn anything. So, but I did not say that to her, so don't judge me. So that's the kind of thing you want to avoid, right? You want to think about what are you know, ways to actually teach somebody that will actually assist them, right? And will actually give them things that they need. The word that we use in special ed is functionality. So here's an example of something people might actually be interested in learning or being able to reproduce. This is the way we've come up with a way of teaching the plan of salvation for those of you who are Christians, right? So I'm stuck and sick in my sin. Jesus died on the cross for me. I'm forgiven. After I'm forgiven, I get the free gift of salvation. And I always say to my folks, I say, you know, it's really great. After you ask for your forgiveness of sins, then you kind of work really hard. And if you try really, really hard, then God will give you the paycheck of forgiveness. It's not a paycheck, Jeff. It's a free gift. I go, okay, that's right. Exactly. It's not a paycheck. And then they receive the Holy Spirit. Well, my friends always say, then they receive the Holy Chicken, because they don't like my drawing of the Spirit. I don't appreciate that, actually, when they refer to it as the Holy Chicken. But the Holy Spirit fills your life. And then God prepares a place for you in heaven. And this is your home. And we always say, and what you're going to say when you get to heaven, you're going to see the place where you're going to live, and you're going to say, I'm home. This is the plan of salvation. I actually have a picture of how someone drew this out in order to illustrate that they understood it. And it's a wonderful picture with all kind of scribbly and stuff, but I couldn't find it. But I've used this a lot for people who have the ability to understand this, right? Not everybody has the ability to understand this, but some people do, and so this is a way of kind of helping them to demonstrate their understanding of the plan of salvation, particularly for elder boards who are incredibly worried that you might baptize someone that does not fully understand, and God forbid you do that, right? Some other things that we do, key verses. We go to the beach every summer and we make sand sculptures. So there's a guy who's got his foot in the shark's mouth. But key memory verses. This one is fabulous for people with intellectual disabilities. And they can learn it. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Don't lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he'll make your paths straight. It's a great verse for us, but it's particularly a great verse for people who have difficulty understanding things. And so, like, in my community, I live in the Redlands. I don't know if Redlands means anything to you, but that's where the whole terrorism thing happened when people were killed in San Bernardino. And people will come to me in my group and say, why did God allow that to happen? And I say, I have no idea why God allows that to happen. What does the Bible say? And they say, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Don't lean on your own understanding. Your response is to trust the Lord. You're not going to understand why these things happen. So it's a perfect verse for people to learn, and it kind of guides a ministry. Very, very helpful verse for people to learn from memory. Another key one is the John 3:16. One of the reasons why it's a key verse is because it's often repeated in church. And so because it's repeated in church, you'll immediately hear people from our group saying it with the pastor, and it's kind of like they feel included. Half the time, the things that the pastor is saying are going over their head. They don't understand. But when the pastor will say things like that, they'll be able to chime in. And I always teach them the second part of the thing, too, that God didn't send his son into the world to condemn the world. Right? That's not what it's about. So if you see something bad happen, the response is not to condemn it, but that through him the world might be saved. How can we bring people along, help them to come to forgiveness and so forth? Also helps to explain, to kind of interact with the negative social consequences that occur to you in your life, as well as a result of having a disability. Another key memory verse is Exodus, the Ten Commandments. People with intellectual disabilities don't know the Ten Commandments because people haven't taught them. And I can tell you in most communities, or many communities, particularly on the people who are more on the mild to moderate end of the spectrum, where they may be living independently or somewhat independently in the community, there's very much of a sexual underbelly going on there, with everybody sleeping with each other, and so they don't because nobody has told them what the Bible says about that. So we teach the Ten Commandments. And when I teach the Ten Commandments, I am embarrassingly specific. If you know what I'm saying, right? I'm embarrassingly specific. I'll never forget, it was the cutest thing. We had this couple who were in our group who were boyfriend and girlfriend, and we got to the one, don't commit adultery. And, you know, everybody says, don't commit adultery. I don't have the foggiest idea what that means. And so I said, you know, basically says, don't have sex unless you're married. And this guy goes to his girlfriend, whoa! We didn't know that! Which is so refreshing on the one hand, because now he knows, and now he and his girlfriend are the same as us, right? We know what the Bible says relative to our behavior, and we can choose to agree with it or not agree with it, right? And even in relation to that, it's another beautiful thing. I have a guy who very tempted sexually a lot, and you know, every month or so he'll come in and say, Jeff, I made a mistake this week. And I said, oh, gee, what happened? He goes, I slept with my girlfriend. And I said, well, what did you do when you did that? He goes, well, I told the Lord that I was sorry, and I'll try not to do it anymore. I said, that's the answer. You did the exact right thing. Try not to do it anymore, but if you make a mistake, tell the Lord. When was the last time someone confessed that to you? You see, once again, how these people are leading us and guiding us in the openness, right? The unguardedness is a beautiful thing. But the Ten Commandments is another good thing to teach because people don't know how to act, potentially. Another thing is interact with students according to their chronological age. Look at this man here. He's another dear, dear, dear friend of mine. Every Sunday I sit with him for probably 20 minutes while worship and everything's going on, and we just hang out. But this man probably has 3 words, maybe 5. Pizza, Coca-Cola, Comer. And he comes in, sits down. I sit down next to him. I say, did you have a good week? Had a good week, you know. Do you want agua or do you want cafe? Agua. He has a high voice like that. All right, I give him his agua, come over here. How you doing? You feeling good? Yeah, I'm feeling good. You know, just like this. And then I've taught him where he goes, points to everybody, and he goes. And I said, that's right. These people are all your friends. And then I point to him, and I said, and you and me are friends. Like that. And we just sit there, and he experiences the total acceptance and love of Christ. He's not going to learn the Nicene Creed, right? He's not going to learn the thing of salvation. His level of faith is probably below the first level of faith in Fowler stages. But the fact is his faith level is that he comes to a church, people see him, They give him choices. They love him. They welcome him. He might learn some theological content when he hits somebody, and I say, cut that out. That's about as much theological content as we get. But that is his level of faith, and he wants his faith reinforced at that level. Before he kind of physically started to lose some of his movement, just thinking of the time. Okay, I got to finish the section. He lose the movement, but he used to come up to me when I'd be doing a Sunday school lesson. He'd come up and he'd hold head to head, hold head to head with me and say, pizza, and I'd say, pizza. And he'd say, come here, and I'd say, come here. And then he'd say, Coca-Cola, and he'd move his head away because he knows I'm supposed to say, are you going to McDonald's after church? You're going to get Coca-Cola? And then he'd go sit down. Now at the start, everybody in the room, when he would start to do that, we're all like, oh, geez, here we go again. And one of the lessons is that just because you have disability doesn't mean that you're perfect. You know, people with intellectual disabilities are impatient with people with autism. People with autism are impatient with people with physical disabilities, right? And people with autism are also very impatient with people who don't have disabilities, right? Because we're trying to do all this interaction with them, and sometimes that's not what they want. And people without disabilities are impatient with everybody. So there's a degree to which we all grow in the process of that, and that was part of it. One, to show him that he had total access, but the other thing is to tell the other people, lighten up and back up. This is my minute with Eddie. That has become a part of his worship routine wherever, where he sees that he has access. I'll leave it there. I did that. Prayer. Prayer is the most incredible leveler in a disability ministry for people with, particularly with people with intellectual disabilities, right? It's interesting, the Bible says, I'm not impressed with your many words. Right? And it also, God says that, and God also says, I know what your thoughts, I know what you're going to say before you even say it. Right? I have this woman, she is a dear prayer partner of mine. Her name is, what is her name? Courtney. That's right, I lost it for a second. Courtney. And Courtney is a woman with quite severe disabilities. And the thing that I'll do is I will go and I'll say, Courtney, would you pray for me? And she says, yes. And I sit down in front of Courtney, and I put my hands on you just to touch you. And I will lean forward, and she'll put her hands on me like this, or put her hands on my head, and she'll just say, help Jeff, help Jeff, help Jeff, help Jeff. And then she says, I'm trying to be a good girl. Amen. It's beautiful. It's beautiful, right? Right? But that's an aspect of prayer, right? I've also taught them, how do you pray? You pray, help me. Right? Don't need a bunch of words. And if someone, imagine if you were in a difficult situation and some person came up and put their hand on you and said, help him, help her, as a prayer. Incredibly beautiful ministry to you. Right? Don't need a bunch of freaking words. A beautiful ministry to you. And the thing is, I stand up here, or some pastor stands up here and I start going off on all the, these beautiful phrases and everything like that, and I'm very much self-impressed with my phrases, and the next person comes up and prays something very simple, and the prayers are absolutely equal, and absolutely equal in power. I'll never forget, we had this guy, the speaker yesterday to talk about cancer. We have a woman in our group who is going through cancer, and I said to this guy, John, would you pray for the woman's cancer? Yes, Jeff. And I said, oh, I'll pray. And he said, I hate cancer. Amen. Beautiful. Amazing. Right? Amazing. What more do you have to say? It's like if God's waiting for you to say, okay, guide the fingers. Because if God doesn't know, he's not going to guide the fingers, right, of the physician and all this stuff like that. I hate cancer. Right? God says, I hate it too. But I can use it to my glory, whatever. But it's just beautiful, the leveling notion of prayer. Then there's other kinds of things, but all related to teaching people like adults. When you're in our group, I don't care what your level of disability, wide range of individuals with disabilities you've already indicated. We talk about adult concepts. We talk about how we don't love our neighbor. We talk about how life is tough. We talk about how to grow in our faith, and et cetera, et cetera. Same things you talk about in any group. Information about different things, activities. All of our activities are adult activities. All of them are adult activities. If you're doing activities in your group and they're not adult activities, you are demeaning the people who are in your group. If you're singing When You're Happy and You Know It and you clap your hands with adults with disabilities, you are demeaning those people. Because if I came by your adult Sunday school class, would I hear you singing, Are You Happy and You Know It, clap your hands, and making Jesus out of popsicle sticks? I would not see that, right? So when I see somebody walking around with Jesus-shaped popsicle sticks, is my response to say, gee, I got to get in that class. No, my response is, there must be something wrong with that person because adults don't make Jesus-shaped popsicle sticks, right? We were talking yesterday, an incredible session on the Hebrew, and we were talking about the passage about don't put a stumbling block in front of the blind and don't curse the deaf. I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but to me that passage means don't do things to people that they don't understand that you're doing to them, right? If I have a ministry and you're all adults with intellectual disabilities and we're singing happy and you know it, clap your hands and making, crafts that are juvenile, childish crafts, you're not going to know that these are things that are demeaning you among everybody else in the congregation who looks at you. You don't realize that, but I do, right? I do. But you know what I'm saying? I'm projecting on you that I think you're a child. That's what I'm doing. And so my projection on you, to some degree, ultimately becomes the reality. Because I'm the expert in disability, I project on you that you're a child, so all the other people in the environment say, well, I guess they must be a child, because Jeff thinks he's a child. No, we demean people with the ministry and the things that we do. Someone should walk past your class for adults with intellectual disabilities and wonder if it's just another Bible study with adults that's just meeting there. Maybe they'll think, well, gee, that's a pretty inclusive class. I haven't seen one like that, but that should be the only thing they should think. Everything else is adult in the way that's presented. That's kind of why Bill kind of suggested the idea of growing up disability ministry. There are adult ministries that are celebrated in this country, and they teach adults with muppets. I won't celebrate that ministry, because I know exactly what it's doing. It's projecting on those people that the people who are running that ministry think they're children, and they're not children. Do I need to be more specific? I'm almost ready to swear, but I haven't yet. But it's a huge problem. Adult age appropriateness is a huge adult. Class structure, worship, everything is adult. Everything that we do is adult, and it wouldn't be distinguished from any other class. You may have questions about that. We'll have time in a minute. But let's switch over. So that would be kind of medical model aspects or approaches to ministry. Let's switch over now to social model aspects of ministry. So we've changed from trying to develop the faith, etc., of the individual to now we're turning and we're looking at the social environment. Because the other aspect that we said the definition of disability was discrimination by the environment. So if I want to address disability, I address the aspects of the individual, but I also address the environment. Let me give you 3 things that some colleagues and I have come up with relative to addressing the social environment. The first one is this idea called social healing. And Ben mentioned that I can't hardly do a presentation without talking about Wolfensberger. If you're not a Wolfensberger fan, forgive me. But Wolfensberger has a great description of what are referred to as the social consequences of disability, and he kind of describes them in what are referred to as the 18 wounds. Now, if you go on my weblog, once again, Disabled Christianity, you can see a discussion of the 18 wounds if you want more information about that. But they're basically things like, because I have a disability, I experience social isolation, I live in poverty. The only people who are with me, who are my friends, are paid to be with me or have no choice but to be with me. There's those kinds of things. People are seeking to take my life. I don't get typical life experiences. Those are all aspects of the social consequences of disability. Well, the idea of social healing is the potential feeling of healing that a person with an impairment feels through the elimination of the social consequences of disability. So imagine if I'm out in the community. What does our shared vision of Christian community look like? Our speakers prior to this touched on this a little bit. It's an important question to ask. What does our shared vision of Christian community look like? Who's present in our biblical vision of community? One of the things that bugs me, these pastors, all self-righteous. We love all people the same. And I say, then why aren't we all here? If we love us all the same. There's a whole bunch of people that ain't here because you don't love people all the same. But what is our shared vision of Christian community? Who is present in our vision of community? How can the inclusion of vulnerable people better reflect the gospel vision and therefore strengthen our church community? How might we much more closely approach this vision here and now within the church? And given the actual makeup of our membership, might we be unintentionally or unconsciously putting some people or groups of people outside of our vision? The answer, would you answer those questions for yourselves? You say, well, would be dead, or you take a step to try to move forward. Last one. Once again, competence. And this goes to the core values of your church. Every church has core values, core mission statement kind of stuff. Does the church's core values and mission adequately reflect the changes required for the church to more fully include members whom society has devalued? See, sometimes the basic core principles are prohibitive as to who we will include or who we'll choose not to include. And people will point to those things and say, I can't do this because of the mission. Does the church engage in reflection and self-evaluation regarding the participation of devalued people in life and ministry of the church? Not to the degree we should, particularly in the disability world. And then this is the coup de grace. What evidence can the church collect for itself to gauge progress towards the mission of including devalued people? You know, is there something we can do to measure whether we're getting better at this thing called inclusiveness or inclusive settings of devalued people? And then as we think through this, we think what would be better. Quick example. Let's say we have a church group meeting on Thursday nights, and they have all the people with intellectual disabilities in that group. And we think about the notion of when do most church members meet at the church at Sunday morning? We're meeting at Thursday night. Okay, I say, can I change the meeting from Thursday night to Sunday night? Yeah, we can do that. Okay, taking a step towards inclusion. Now we're meeting Thursday night. And we say, hey, you know, there's an empty room right after the regular worship service at 1 o'clock. Could we have the folks with disabilities meet at 1 o'clock instead of 6 o'clock? Sure, because now there's a chance that when they're coming, they mix with people who are going, right? Taking a step further. Well, you know what? There's actually that extra room there that's during the same time as the worship service. What's the chance that we could have those people meet at the same time? And they meet at the same time. You see what I'm doing here? My vision is that we're going to all be together in the sanctuary at the same time. The sanctuary is going to change, and the sermon's going to be louder because the person's making noise, and everything's going to be way different than it was. But if I go in and say, that's what I want to do, they're going to say, go down the street. There's a church that might want to talk to you about that. But if I take these small steps, it's the potential to do that. Very last thing. Professors say one last thing and then they keep going. But I promise you this is the very last thing. And that is that my wife and I at our current church have been doing our current church ministry for 25 years. When we first showed up at that church, it was nuts. I showed up with a PhD in special ed and 15 years of disability ministry experience. And my wife is an administrator of special ed with the same. We walked in, the pastor said, we want to start a ministry of people with disabilities. And they said, people with disabilities are not a priority. That's how we entered our ministry. My wife and I walked out, and I don't know whether she said to me or I said to her, they will be when we start bringing them. Right? Fast forward 25 years to God's glory. We just had our pastor left. We're looking for a new pastor. As our congregation is reflecting on who they are, they said the defining characteristic of our congregation is our disability ministry. What would the community not have if this church was not here? The only thing they would not have would be a ministry that includes people with disabilities. Now, we have a long way to go, but people at the church will say disability ministry is our DNA. And how did that happen? 25 years of small steps. God bless you. You've been wonderful to listen to me. And I think we have time for some questions or comments.
So we'll open up for questions. Carol?
Hi, Jeff. You have a lot more confidence in special ed than I do, and I'm a special ed professor, too. We have to talk about that. Maybe you can build me up there.
Let's do it.
I'm wondering about the tension between reifying normalcy, so helping people to become more normal and to fit in better, and the tension between that and Vanier's breaking the cult of normalcy. Any comments on that?
Great question. And that's what that's your criticism. If you're not familiar with Wolfensberger, that's always the criticism of Wolfensberger, is that the notion of trying to make people normal. The more I read of Wolfensberger, he's not trying to make people normal. What he is saying is that in order to be successful in the society the way it is right now, there are certain things that we have to do, right? And so the thing is I am totally down with Vanier saying changing the normal. But once again, if my friend who is the guy who was beaten and left for dead shows up to church and says to everybody, you need to love me by the way I am, there's never going to be any change. There's never going to be any change at all. So the thing I have to do on the one hand is try to work with the social environment to say, quit being so doggone discriminatory towards people, but at the same time, I need to say to the person, listen, you may choose not to be, quote, normal and not take a shower and not do these things, but you need to recognize, for good or ill, there are social consequences of acting that way, right? And I'm not saying that the way that they'll treat you is right. I agree. Imagine I'm in a conversation with these people saying, you need to change so society will love you better. And it's kind of like it's totally opposed to everything that I believe, right? That society should love people independent of their characteristics. But at the same time, I understand how society is. And if I want to make it easier for you to love people, there's a degree to which you need to play the game a little bit, at least in the short term, until we ultimately win. Because we totally have God on our side. There's no doubt about it. It's not that the church is going to change ultimately and say, oh, we're going to become more discriminatory and more exclusionary. No, no, because we have God's on our side. It's ultimately going to be the direction where we all want it to go. But it's going to take us time to get there. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah. So, is it working? Hi, I'm Ruti, and as a person with a couple of the disabilities you're describing, I actually see it really differently, and I'm wondering about power and who owns narrative, because the way I see it, I'm a rabbinic student. That's something I've had to fight for, and I feel what I do on a day-to-day basis is show up and say, you need to welcome me the way I am. You need to welcome other disabled people the way we are. And I have made change, so why isn't that okay? Why isn't that on the table in ministry?
It's totally okay. I mean, the most important thing that a person with disability, I think, can do to change a church is be present. However you are, whatever your characteristics are, is to be present. My point was only, my point is only that unless people have superhuman love, which they don't, I need to approach them recognizing that their biggest problem right now in the church is that they don't love their neighbor. And if I approach them saying, you need to do something that you are already evidencing that you're unwilling to do, my response would be, is there any way how I can make it, at least in the short term, a little easier for you to do the right thing, and then move you to the place where you will accept? I mean, I would, well, listen, I agree with you. Don't be upset with me. I agree with you. The point, I apologize. The point I'm making is that that is not the way people are. That is not the way people are. People are excluding people like crazy for minimal, minor characteristics that they have, right? I'm not saying it's superhuman love. I'm saying they perceive it that way. Forgive me if I upset you. I apologize.
I just wanted to ask you about the website. What would be better? Is all those questions on there? Is there more? Could you tell me more about resources that you would have?
The website has the article and a variety of other types of things. It has illustrations about how we've actually used this to facilitate changes. There's one article in particular about with my own church where, I'm just being real, right? I mean, there was a guy with intellectual disability wanted to serve as a greeter. And I was like, absolutely. And so he served as a greeter. He was a man who lived in a group home. His teeth were a bit rotten and his clothing were not perfect. People in the church took pictures of him and sent it to the pastor and said, is this the type of person that we want as a greeter here, right? So when I'm saying that people are not loving, I'm not projecting it on people. I'm telling you the way that they actually are. But the thing that we did was that we talked to the pastor and said, listen, we made a misstep here. Maybe we should have prepared the congregation a little better for this because, once again, I want to make it easier for people to do the right thing. So we said there are individuals who are going to be acting as greeters, and the congregation changed. So there was a point, once again, I'm just trying to be real. There was a point where there was a man who was a greeter who would be greeting while he was incontinent, right? So when you entered our church, you would smell urine or feces at the entry point of our church, and the man would greet you and give you your bulletin, right? Now, once again, there was preparation that was required to bring people to that point because people will not come to that point on their own, right? So, yeah.
Jeff, I'm addressing you as a clergy person and academic colleague and a person with lived experience of disability who understands all the models that you've expressed and articulated this morning pretty effectively. And yet I'm left with the question, Why do you think it is that the onus always falls on the person with the lived experience of disability to make other people more loving and more comfortable and more accepting?
That's a great question. And hopefully I relayed that that is not what I'm saying. I'm saying that I want the environment to change. And I said the starting point is that the church is disobedient. And so the thing is, I want, to the degree that people with disabilities are able, I want them to try to make it a little easier for people to love them, potentially. And once again, I mean, I know I'm probably insulting people by saying that. I'm reflecting of the reality of the way society is. But society is discriminatory, and society needs to change.
I live in that society, and I live with that reality myself. And I navigate that reality every day. I'm not disputing that we're disobedient, and I'm not disputing that society is sinful and that we're not loving to one another. But my challenge to you in the way that you're presenting your model is that perhaps the challenge I'm thinking about my words so that they'll come out in a clear way. That the challenge perhaps needs to be addressed more or a little more equally toward the congregation. What I'm hearing you say is that the congregation or the faith community is unable to change, and therefore the community of persons with disabilities is not able to participate, but rather being objectified in order to change the value of the congregation.
I would argue, I would actually take the opposite position. I would say, like, take for example, my friend with mental illness. My friend with mental illness had very little capacity to change. So the entire onus is on the congregation. And one of the reasons why the congregation refuses to change is because they don't see people, particularly my world, people with severe intellectual disabilities, they don't see them as people of value. And to me, that is a direct reflection of the way that they have been taught by those over them. That we have a notion of who people are and what is valuable that has been taught to us within our denominations that is not true.
I'm just trying to reflect back to you how I experienced some of your presentation.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Cindy.
Thank you. You've given a lot of food for thought, and sometimes I was listening to you thinking I want to stand on the table and go, yes, yes, yes. And other times I'm like, oh, I don't know. I got to worry about this a little bit. So as somebody who has held the hand of somebody in the moccasins for 29 years, and then I put my own on 20 years ago as a person with a disability, I have a lot to think about, just like some of these folks have said. The one thing that I thought was really interesting is your couple at the beginning who gave birth to a child with a disability, and they were told right off the bat by a church person, don't have room for you. And while that's cruel and unchristian and whatever, good for them. Because I kind of hung around at church as I went from church to church when my son was ready to go into religious ed, catechism, as we Catholics call it. And I had to go to the 5th church in my town, thank God it's a big enough town, that finally said, yes, he will be included. Because I said, they're 5 years old, they're all kind of quirky. When he got into 2nd grade, when they're all getting First Communion, the nice catechist said, I don't think he gets it. And I said, it's faith, it's a mystery. I don't get it either. I don't think any of us gets it. Let's move forward. So here we are, he's 29, so that all started, let's say, when he was 25. And the pendulum in my town, in my county, in the state of Illinois, has not moved at all. Has not moved at all, either in the secular world or in the church world. We're still sending kids in a parish to go 3 parishes over to learn about the Word of God when they've got a perfectly good parish. right in their own neighborhood. And so I guess, and I work in a church, and I facilitate. I tell the music director, this is how this kid with autism is going to be. And they're like, okay, Cindy, we'll do what you say. And it's really nice when they do that. I go home and I get excited about that. I think my caution would be that when we're starting this, and disability ministry to me is not for me or my son or the folks here, it's for the rest of the people. It's for the non-disabled people to learn what they're supposed to do and how to welcome me and say, hey, do you need a ride? I noticed your bus didn't show up. Gee, you're sitting there for an hour. Didn't your bus show up? Okay. It's all those kinds of things, right? So I would caution with what you're doing. It's great. 25 years, it's great. But if we're starting things right from the ground up, I would really hesitate to start a separate program because, oh my goodness, do we love those separate programs. And we can't get away from them. And once they're started, they're so inculcated with, well, it still becomes, and I honor the work you do. Please do not let me miscommunicate with you. But we're starting from the ground up at this church, and we've got a little boy with Down syndrome, and we've got the high school kids going, oh, we're going to support the little guy, and it's working. And he is teaching them so much. His joy and his glee and his silliness is teaching them, and he's teaching the other kids too. So I guess as we're moving forward, do not fall in love right at the beginning of those segregated places, because 30 years from now, I'll be really old to come back here. But I warn you, they will still be here, and we will still be pushing that pendulum and forward. Catholic Church has wonderful documents from the 1970s, and we're still wondering, why are we still pushing that? So thank you all for the good work you do, but I would be very cautious. Start out with the being in the fabric of the society first. So thank you for your good work.
Great comment. Let me just respond with a couple things. One is I totally agree. At my desire, people with disabilities would be integrated anywhere they wanted to be, anywhere within the church, in anything they wanted to do. There'd be no segregation unless they chose it, right? People with intellectual disabilities have told me that they are delighted to finally be at a place where they understand the scriptures. So, now for me, if the persons that I'm hoping to serve tell me that this degree, where they're in a room where, you know, if that's, once again, let's say there's 60 people and 40 of them are people with some form of disabilities and 20 people are not, and they go from that to worship in the regular worship service, or maybe they go from that to serve in the children's ministry or something like that, I would prefer that everything was, I told you about my faith development idea. Ideally, faith development would be not intellectually based so that everybody could be totally together all the time, right? But I also respond to what people tell me. If people with intellectual disabilities tell me, I want this place because the scriptures are explained to me in a way that I understand, I have to respond to what they want as well. Now, there's a problem with that on some level because, I mean, it's the whole choice thing. If the only thing I've ever had to choose was vanilla ice cream, and you ask me what kind of ice cream I want, I'm going to say I want vanilla because I never had chocolate. So if they have never had the full opportunity for full inclusion, maybe they would choose that if they had the opportunity, but there's a degree to which, you know, for good or ill, where we're at right now, the option that seems the best in their mind and for us as well is what we're currently doing. But we are hoping to move forward.
So this will be the last question, and then we'll continue the conversation over lunch. Bill will have a few announcements after this.
Thanks, Jeff. I suppose my question is back on the issue that kind of has dominated the discussion. And I wonder if part of the difficulty is the language of making it easier for someone to love me is maybe a very emotive way to put it. And I wonder if there's a place where you're seeing step-by-step progress. But, you know, my thought about the guy that was greeting and telling, you know, prepare the church for the fact that there's going to be a guy who's greeting who maybe they wouldn't expect. I belong to the Presbyterian Church in Ireland, and they issued a leaflet for people in churches as to how to accept people with intellectual disabilities. And they said, these are 6 things you might have to deal with. And one was personal hygiene. And I mean, I wanted to go to church house and burn it, but I probably would have been arrested, but it might have been worthwhile because people greet me in church who are able-bodied, who have personal hygiene problems. And do I get to send a picture of them. I mean, it reeks from them. And is it okay if I tell my pastor I don't want them to greet me because they stink? You know, so how do we get from the point where people feel it's okay to point that out and the pastor has to respond to that, to the fact that it's not okay to point that out unless we can point it out about everybody?
There's two responses to that, and thank you. And thank you all. I mean, I recognize a lot of things I've said are controversial, and hopefully they've stimulated, even if you don't agree. But just to get back to this, if there is a problem in the way that we as the Christian church have been fed for a long time. We have been fed in a way that we think it's okay to send pictures of a person who is devalued by society to our pastor and say, I don't want him here. I mean, I can see people maybe thinking something like that, but we have been fed to the point where we feel like we have the ability to actually do something like that. So once again, there is a huge change that needs to be made. I agree with you. The environment, the church is disobedient. I started out by saying that. And we have a long way to go, and it's going to start, I think, with people like this at high levels in theological institutions changing the leadership, because the leadership is the one who has brought us, I think, on some level to the place where we are. Thank you for listening.